Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Early, and I'm the Dean of the UTS Business School. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar with our very special guests, Professor Michael Spence and Professor David Brady. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City campus now stands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Today's webinar is brought to you as part of a unique partnership between the UTS Business School and Stanford Australia Foundation. This partnership is committed to significantly strengthening the exchange of academic excellence and building capacity of the not-for-profit sector in Australia. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome Stanford Australia Foundation guests to today's webinar. I'd also like to welcome the UTS alumni with us today. Whether you're in Sydney or around the globe, thank you and welcome. Now, before we begin, some house rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available as a download soon by email, various UTS social media channels, including the UTS YouTube channel. And to minimize any technical interruptions and distractions, we've deactivated your cameras and microphones. The format for today is Mike, David, and I will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have 30 minutes or so for Q&A. We welcome questions during today's presentation, so please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. And thank you to the many people who have submitted questions when registering. We will get to them as many as possible. I'd now like to introduce our very special guests today. Our special guests we actually want to welcome them back to UTS. Many of today's participants will remember the deep insights they provided to us on COVID last year and the world economy and the likely outcome of the US presidential election. Today, they'll review with us the first 100 days of the Biden administration. Our first commentator and participant is Professor David Brady. David is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and the Freeman Spogli Institute. He's also the Bowen H. and Janice Arthur McCoy Professor in Leadership Values at Stanford University. And he holds the Morris M. Doyle Centennial Chair in Public Policy, Emeritus status. David's research focuses on the American Congress, the party system, and public policy. He's at present working on a book about the electoral basis of political instability in the United States and its effects on polarization and gridlock in the policy arena. As many of the audience knows, David gave us an insightful presentation on unstable American politics and the 2020 election in July of last year. You will recall that in this talk, David predicted a Biden win, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him back to reflect on what has been accomplished in the first 100 days.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, David. Our second participant and honored guest is Professor Michael Spence, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and Philip H. Knight Professor and Dean Emeritus at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. In 2001, Mike was awarded a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his contributions to the analysis of markets with asymmetric information. He's the chairman of an independent commission on growth and development, created in 2006, and focused on growth and poverty reduction in developing countries. He's also served as a member of the boards of directors for several public and private companies, and Mike is also a member of the American Economic Association and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometric Society. In June last year, Mike presented a brilliant talk on the world after the pandemic, convergence or divergence. His analysis greatly aided our thinking about the course of last year, and again, it is my pleasure to welcome back Professor Mike Spence. Oh God. So Mike and David, thank you very much for coming and joining us. We now have, I think, everyone on the screens. We also will have a special appearance later on in this session by Professor Bruce McKern, who currently is a adjunct professor at UTS Business School and a close colleague of mine, including a member of my International External Advisory Board. So we'll be seeing Bruce coming back and joining us at the end of our first 30-minute session. So, Mike and David, question to open for both of you, and either who wishes to start is fine with me. What's your overall assessment of President Joe Biden's first 100 days as the 46th President of the United States?
Well, okay. Thanks, Dave. And Chris, I'll take a shot at it. I think it's an impressive start. The Biden administration, inherited a deeply conflictful situation from the election. Even a kind of contested outcome, and a chaotic situation in the vaccine rollout area. They've really done a pretty good job of getting that organized, and I think the data support that. He managed to get a second very large sort of stimulus program that was designed to buffer the remaining shock from the pandemic economy through Congress, and we are in the midst in the United States of a pretty rapid economic recovery. So overall, without going into details, I think you'd probably give it fairly high marks.
David, what do you think? Oh, David, you're on mute.
I agree with Mike. I think it is a fairly impressive start. I think that the way he started to deal with COVID is the right way to start. What the main fear that the Biden administration should have is that his two previous Democratic predecessors, in Bill Clinton in '92 and then Barack Obama, pushed policy to the left, and the result was, in both cases, with healthcare. But the result in both cases was that in the off-year election, 1994, the Republicans won the House and the Senate for the first time in 40 years. And in 2010, they lost 63 seats in the House of Representatives. And given the very narrow margins, 50-50 in the Senate and a 6-seat majority in the House, I think the big problem for Biden is going to be how far left does he go, what happens. So two other achievements I think that are pretty good. In foreign policy, I think that he avoided the mistakes, in my view, that Barack Obama made in not dealing sufficiently with China and not making the pivot to the east first. Biden, on the other end, in regard to Russia and the European situation, he's been much tougher on Putin, but suggests that he wants to talk. So he's setting his own foreign policy, which wants to sort of bring America back. And I think that's been, on the whole, there's still some challenges to go, but on the whole, he's done well.
So before the pandemic hit in late 2019, President Trump was seen as to have been benefiting from a growing economy across all sorts of measures. But obviously, COVID created a global economic uncertainty, to say the least. Now, fast forward to the 2020 election campaign. President Biden campaigned heavily on the economy and leading a pandemic recovery with a range of policies, including, as you mentioned, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which was recently brought into law. So, Mike, if I may start with you here, what do you think of Biden's economic policy commitments going into that we're going into the election? And now, how have they performed in this first 100 days?
Again, I think on the whole, it's positive. I mean, so let's backtrack. I mean, I think that if we hadn't had the pandemic, the performance of the American economy was such that, it would have been difficult for the Democrats to take the White House because the economy has a fairly substantial effect. And that notwithstanding, the sort of polarized state of our both politics and society. I think so. What David and I said last year was that to a very large extent, the Trump administration lost the election on the handling of the pandemic. And the polls and surveys that Dave has conducted with his colleagues that illustrate that. So I think it opened a window for Biden to run on the economy in two dimensions. One, restoring economic momentum via effective containment of the virus, which in the case of the entire world, except for a few Asian countries, really means getting the virus, getting the vaccine rollout right. So they made that a priority, and it seems to have worked. And secondly, there's a very important thread in the Biden economic policies that we need to talk about, which has to do with the distribution of the benefits of the growth that the economy produces. I mean, we all know, plus or minus, what the distributional trends have been. And it's the goal of the Biden administration, if they can pull it off, to start to reverse that. So the stimulus, was designed to help the people who had been adversely affected get back on their feet. We know the pandemic economy was a negative shock from a distributional point of view. And I think, the next round, which is still in the process of negotiation, which is called the infrastructure program, but really is a much broader attempt to invest in the dynamism of the economy in a way that produces relatively benign outcomes from a distributional point of view. So the minimum wage would affect the low wage people. The jobs that go along with an infrastructure program will bolster middle income jobs and so on. So I think to understand where Biden's going, whatever the challenges and hurdles may be on the way through, it's important to understand that he's not just focused on the sort of macroeconomic top line. He's really focused on, sort of pulling people together. He's been criticized for not having a very targeted program in the stimulus, but I actually think, he was playing that may be correct. We could have economized on this 1.9 trillion by focusing in a more laser-like, fashion on the people who had been hurt. But the truth is, the whole population in the United States and everywhere else in the world was hurting. And I think Biden wanted to send an inclusive message. So he made a political choice along with his team to make that program very broad. And I think it's been largely well received so far. Now, whether or not the other thing that's coming up, Chris, and Dave knows a lot about this, is a bunch of changes in taxes that are designed to pay for all of this. And one of the big deal items in that is an increase in the corporate profits tax. So we'll undoubtedly, he is now marching into territory where resistance may be quite a bit higher, and we really don't know yet what the outcome of that will be.
Dave, what are your thoughts on Biden's economic policies going into the election, and how have they performed and resonated with the American populace?
Well, Mike and I were on record in quite a few articles in Project Syndicate, so I can't disagree with him there. So I agree with it there. I also think that I am fully in agreement with the $1.9 trillion bill, especially in the following sense. That bill could have gotten him in trouble because, as Mike said, it was much broader. It wasn't laser targeted. The Republicans proposed a much more laser targeted one. And I don't think that hurt him. And what we found in the polls was, while Republicans said, a majority of Republicans says we're opposed to it, on the specific items, $1,400 checks, $300 for insurance on unemployment, et cetera. Though every one of those, save the boost in state and local employees, had a majority of Republicans for it. And part of the reason for that is because Donald Trump has brought into the Republican Party a whole bunch of high school or less educated white voters who are the beneficiaries of those. So the crucial question for Biden as he moves ahead on the very broad infrastructure bill, on my view, is with a very tight majority. I think, so think of it this way. What if you're Biden, you've got pressures from the left wing in your party. And so if you started with a narrow bill on this new $2 trillion infrastructure bill, which has much more in the infrastructure in it, then what you'd expect is the left would be all over you. So if he puts it forward, and what happens is Manchin from West Virginia and Hassan in New Hampshire don't buy parts of it, and the corporate tax goes from 25 to 21, and they don't raise the capital gains tax quite as much, then Biden's in a position to say to his left wing, look, we tried that, it didn't work, this is what we're taking. So in my view, the first part of his plan, quite successful. The $1.9 trillion worked. And now the question is on the new infrastructure bill, the interesting part is what kind of changes are going to be made, and how does that sell? And I think his presidency hangs on that. And by his presidency, I mean, if he's going to continue to make progress in these issues, they have to hold the House and the Senate in 2022. So what I mean by success, electoral success.
But Dave, just as a quick follow-up, the goal, one of the goals for Biden during the campaign was bipartisanship and bringing things together. It sounds like if he has some faltering or not missteps, but some pushback and lack of success on this next multi-trillion-dollar effort, the infrastructure plan, that you're saying that it could actually be an advantage because it could give an opportunity for the left in the party to be placated, that they tried, but at the same time, it means the GOP might have a more substantive input and some of them might jump on board. What do you think about that?
I agree with that 100%. The only thing I would say, I wouldn't say the left wing of the Democratic Party would be placated. I don't see AOC as placated on much of anything, or Bernie, but the point is they wouldn't have much to say because he put it out and it didn't work. So there you have it. Well, think of Senator Sanders. He was chairman of the committee dealing with on the $1.9 trillion bill. They wanted to raise the minimum wage to 15. And the reason they couldn't raise the 15 was, first of all, it didn't meet these arcane rules on sequestration, but there weren't enough Democratic votes for it. Manchin and a few other Democratic senators wouldn't vote for it. So I think your summary was exactly right.
So Mike, in your presentation last year with UTS and with the Stanford Australia Foundation, you predicted the global pandemic would most likely reinforce, if not exacerbate, some of the existing geopolitical tensions, including those between the US and its allies in China. And I would say one of those allies, of course, is Australia. And we're experiencing a great deal of tension with China right now ourselves. For both of you, and then David, you also had predicted in your presentation last year these geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China, and that this could be a key election challenge or issue for the next president to deal with. So, for both of you, do you think that President Biden, is likely to place the U.S.-China relationship on a more productive footing, given all of these complexities? Mike, why don't you address that first?
I think there'll be sort of, first of all, the underlying tensions are real. I mean, there's a range of issues, from governance and even different values to trade, to services, to technology competition, to national security, to, behavior in various parts of the world and so on. And on the American side, perhaps the single area of, bipartisan agreement remains, antithetical views toward China. So I think the Biden administration, when they came in, was in the position of, one, having a big domestic agenda that they, at the top of the list, and two, no real political room to maneuver on the question of China, at least not in taking major steps, and certainly not in sort of reversing ground or doing anything that signaled that they were unconcerned about the broad range of issues that not just the United States, but European countries, Australia, and others have with the way China has conducted business in the last at least 5 or 6 years. So I think what's going on is political pragmatism and realism. That is, they're focused on the things that they think are important. I mean, the people in the Biden administration and lots of others think that our ability to deal effectively with China, whether we're cooperating or competing, will be a lot easier if we sort of right the domestic ship and look like we're, functioning reasonably well. And because that affects our status in the world, and it affects, our strength, basically. If we're going to have a technology competition, we might as well sort of get on with it, do it right. Now, we haven't got all those, pieces lined up. But I think, so once you get beyond those things, those are sort of realistic and fairly binding constraints. What you have is a situation in which, you can have a relatively grown up approach to China that focuses on things that are really important. Like where can we cooperate where it really matters, like climate change, perhaps areas of health, perhaps, cooperating in a multilateral effort to do a better job of dealing with the next pandemic, if and when we have one, and so on. So I think we'll see that. The trade war didn't make a whole lot of sense from either side's point of view, but that's an example, I think, where the constraints are binding. And so he can't just walk in and, as his first act, undo the dysfunctional elements of the trade war we were in. And so I basically, what bottom line is, we'll try to have a more constructive, slightly conflictful relationship with China, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Dave, what are your thoughts along those lines about a more productive or more problematic relationship with China? But also, what would you recommend, or what do you think are some of the key issues moving forward for the U.S. with China relations?
Well, I think the first thing, if President Trump had done it right, there are many European countries that had the same set of problems with China that we do, and a joint European-U.S. outreach and deal with China would have been much better. So what I think he's done, so the key issues are, I agree with Mike, he's kept the tariffs there for a reason, but they're going to talk about dropping them in a reasonable way. Second, he has reached out to Europe to talk about how there might be a joint policy. I think most importantly, it's important that first guest that Biden hosted was the Prime Minister of Japan. The relationships, I do some work with the Korean Consul General here. The Koreans are quite happy, the Vietnamese are quite happy, so Biden and the Biden administration are reaching out to the right people in the Pacific region that are important, that are going to be really important on the issue of what's China's ambitions in the South China Sea. So my view is it's going to be a realistic policy. It is going to make compromises where compromises are necessary. I can't give you a specific on exactly what those are. They're going to have to work those out, but it will be much more of an adult, rational policy that thinks these things through. And I think the Biden administration, most importantly, understands that Japan and Korea and our other allies in the region depend upon China's economy is more important to them than the U.S. So they understand that Japan and Korean allies have that relationship with China and need to have it for their own economic stability. And on the other hand, like Australia, also same position. Australia, we need to get the politics separate from the economics. And I think the Biden administration and the people he's put in generally understand that, and will work around that and come up with a more reasonable policy than we've had in the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
I'd go back, I'd say 8 years. I would include the last 4 of Obama also.
So for both of you, again, open question. Do you consider that the world is entering into a post-pandemic recovery at this stage, or does the rising infection rate that we're seeing, which is very alarming in India and Brazil, imply a continuing worldwide risk? What will Biden's priorities for the U.S. over the next 2 years possibly be, including dealing with a COVID resurgence, and for the U.S. but other regions in the world? What do you think?
Well, I think that so there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and we just don't know whether we're going to get recurring resurgences with variants coming at us. We hope not. But I think the best guess is that we're in a cascading series of fairly rapid recovery. So America is running pretty, hot right now, intensely. UK, similarly, Europe is behind, but is catching up in terms of the virus, the vaccine rollout. And I expect, eye-popping growth numbers in the recovery process, where we sort of clamber back to where we were before the pandemic started in 2019. And I think there's a reasonable, a number of Asian countries are already well into recovery because they didn't require vaccines to get the virus under control. And I think, the global rollout of vaccines will accelerate, partly just because, the system will start producing more vaccines, but also because the developed countries that have kind of gone first and have looked selfish are basically going to finish the vaccine rollouts, and they're going to then, feel that they have the political luxury of being a little bit more outward looking with respect to the vaccine rollout. So, they can be criticized for this, but to be honest with you, any politician, that doesn't focus first on the domestic situation is a long life expectancy. So I think this was inevitable, but I think, we can look forward to, on a global basis, a pretty rapid rollout of the vaccines. So my best guess, Chris, is that, we're going to have a cascading sequence of, fairly rapid recoveries that'll probably take us to the end of 2022 to get the whole job done.
Yeah.
I have nothing really to add to that. I do think that in regard to the COVID, there are going to be variants of it, and my understanding is the Moderna and Pfizer are already planning to begin booster shots in the fall for people who've had their shots. So I think it's going to be like the flu. It's going to be around for quite some time, and hopefully the vaccines will make it get the death rate down to acceptable rates like it is for flu.
So Dave, you were sharing with me before we actually got started today some, I think, rather startling statistics about a split or a schism in the United States politically that got implications about uptake for the COVID vaccine. Would you want to share those with us?
Sure. What we're finding is that I believe when I talked to you, I said 40% of Republicans said that they would not be, they did not want a vaccine. That number's down to 36. While we were talking, I just checked the latest YouGov poll. So it's dropped a little, not much. I do expect it to come down a little bit, particularly as what we're going to do in the long run, what the Israelis do with the vaccine card. So that if you haven't gotten doubly vaccine, there's certain things you can't do. So I expect that will come down, but there's a whole set, the people who believe that Biden didn't win the election, the people who think that Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer, was not guilty. Those there are many more Republicans that think that, and it's correlated very highly with the levels of education. So the 2020 election was really the first time, second, only under Trump, I should say, from the only Republican who ever won a majority of the vote of high school or less education since Franklin Roosevelt was Donald Trump. And he won it in 2016, won it in 2020, and that doesn't look like it's going away.
Well, so what do both of you think will be the implications of major spending plans, such as the Green Initiative? You talked a little bit earlier about the infrastructure investments, vaccine delivery, overall, all of these activities for U.S. fiscal stability and potential inflation, despite the low current rates that we're seeing. Do you expect to see changes in the tax structure? You mentioned, both of you mentioned about the tax structure issues and policies towards surges in illegal immigration. What do you think about these?
Well,
Dave?
first of all, on immigration, Biden is doing the worst on immigration. If you ask what kind of job he's doing on the vaccine rollout, he gets pretty good marks, so on and so forth. But the one that he's absolutely the worst shape on is immigration, and that's going to continue to be a problem. In regard to the taxes, they're not going to be, my general view is they're not going to be as high as what he proposed. I don't think they're going to. I'll give you an example. They did not propose reinstating the you can take all the state income taxes that you pay, income and property taxes. That was a huge blow to states like New York and California, which have high property taxes. Mm-hmm. Democrats are pushing to put that back in. If you put back in, you lose a lot of money. They have to make switches elsewhere. So the next 2 or 3 weeks, next month or so is going to be really crucial as to where we are. And my general suspicion is he's not going to get as high a taxes as he wants, and that'll have some implications about what parts of the infrastructure bill and the green bill get through. I think lots of the idea that you're going to have by 2030 neutral emissions, that's not going to happen. There'll be compromises along the way.
Mike, what are your thoughts?
No, I guess I'm slightly more optimistic on that last point. You know, what the Biden administration made a commitment to cut CO2 emissions, fossil fuel-based CO2 emissions by 50% with 2005 as the reference point. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if everybody remembers the numbers, but in 2005, the per capita emissions of CO2 in the United States, Canada, and Australia were in excess of 20 tons, roughly twice the level that the then European countries were running at 10 tons per person. So if we cut back 50% from the 2005 levels, we'll be at where Europe was in 2005, okay? So it may, it may sound like a dramatic, and maybe it is a dramatic gesture. By the way, the United States is already, you know, fairly substantially along the way to that program anyway. I would say we're probably at 15 or 16 tons a person. Apologies for introducing all these numbers, but there's so much sort of hand waving in the climate change area. It's kind of useful every once in a while to go back and take a look at what's going on. I think, you know, on the kind of fiscal situation, first of all, I mean, the bet is that we do not have a kind of imminent inflation problem. But there are serious people, you know, who think that's probably not true. And so the Biden administration's position is, you know, we got to run this risk. And if it materializes, we'll deal with it, meaning the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank. We'll deal with it, and they'll be in a tough position if we do get inflation sometime in the reasonably near future. But I don't think that's imminent. There's all kinds of hidden excess capacity in the economy, and it's certainly not imminent, you know, in the short run because of the pandemic hit that we took. So I think the crucial thing is the things that Dave mentioned, which is, can he get a reasonably substantial fraction of the program that is designed to sort of deal with the kind of underpinnings of the dynamism of the economy. So we're not running on a nearly empty fuel tank. So this is science, this is education, this is infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure. And I think what's on his side there is that it's not just a domestic issue. I mean, he can put this in terms of competition with especially China. And there's lots of, you can be skeptical of some of the sort of claims, but there's basically, serious commentary from presidential commissions and others, some of them appointed before Biden was put in place, that we're, at or near the point of falling behind in critical areas of technology. So I think there's a reasonable chance that a substantial fraction of this package will get through. On the taxes, I mean, I think that objectively, the case that we need to sort of reverse this astonishing decline in corporate profits taxes is probably pretty sound from a kind of objective point of view. Not that there'd be unanimous agreement, but that's different from how it sounds kind of politically. The other thing I would note is the United States, as part of its effort to be cooperative and useful multilaterally, Janet Yellen has been, our Secretary of the Treasury, has been out there proposing that we have a minimum corporate profits tax globally, or at least among the major trading partners, so that we start to get away from this race to the bottom problem that we're very familiar with here in Europe, for example. So they're feeling their way along, but I think, if they keep their eye on the objective, which is kind of reinvigorate in a kind of inclusive way the American economy, Biden knows about compromise. He knows that he doesn't lose if he doesn't get, the whole package. So I think there's a good chance they'll find their way through this.
I have one quick question. So I'm encouraged by that 2005 number. I did not know where the number came from, and I hadn't since it hadn't been a official bill proposal. That is more doable, and so it is the case that it really the detail is in the numbers, and when the House and the Senate are doing the bargaining, it's exactly those things that are going to matter. For example, on the point about Janet Yellen trying to get some sort of an agreement, that's crucial. If you can get that agreement or even a partway step toward it, that makes a lot of the other stuff a lot easier. And so the next month is really, this next month of 6 weeks are going to be really crucial. And the only clue I would give for your listeners is kind of don't agree with Mike, don't watch the hand waving. Look at the Democrats like Manchin of West Virginia, Tester of Montana, who's up for re-election, Hassan of New Hampshire, who's up for. Look at how this policy is affecting them, because that's where he's got to build a majority.
Okay. One final question before we open up to our audience. Optimistically, perhaps, but what do you see as some of the lagging and long-term effects from the pandemic for our recovery?
Well, let me start on the economic side. So I actually think there's, there's some scars, right? Some businesses, we lost businesses, people tend to think of them as small and medium-sized businesses, in those shutdown sectors that we had to shut down because proximity was dangerous. But actually we had some pretty big ones, brand names in the retail space, at least in America, have sort of gone out of business. And so I think, and we have, scars left over, notwithstanding the fiscal packages, that have affected household balance sheets. It really has been an adverse event. But on the positive side, we are in the age of a digital transformation, at least many of us believe we are. And the inertial forces that, that affect both people and organizations with respect to sort of adopting new technologies that have great potential, were substantially overcome in the pandemic economy. So when I look at that situation, what I see is, one, we now have powerful tools, digital tools in multiple dimensions to deal with growth and productivity and so on. We have an economy that's a hard thing to do in an economy that's running with a demand shortfall problem of the type that we had after the great financial crisis, not just in America, but in lots of parts of the world. They're doing their best to run the economy hot at high intensity so the demand side is not a constraint. So you have increased rates of adoption, a whole bunch of learning about resilience and opportunity. And finally, we have lagging, like every economy has lagging sectors, and they're going to change their behavior. I mean, take healthcare. It's not true that you needed, modern, within the last 2 years, technology to have telemedicine. It's just that healthcare doesn't change very fast. Similarly, education, similarly, the construction industry, and there's a reasonable chance they're going to change quickly, because both the supply side and the demand side has decided that there's other opportunities to expand primary care in a highly efficient way So the bottom line is, I mean, there's a lot of color commentary, but I think there's a reasonable chance, and I'm not alone in this, that we're going to see a spurt in productivity and potential growth, and I think that'll probably occur in the United States, and I think with a lag, it may occur on a much broader front as well. So this may be the upside. I mean, nobody would want to have a pandemic to produce this results, but these confluence of factors seems to me that we could be entering productivity and new technology, big, powerful, general purpose technologies come in waves, Chris. And, we had a wave in the late 90s up to the early 2000s, and then it subsided. We had the great financial crisis with all kinds of headwinds. I think we've got another wave coming.
Okay.
I think that for me, the major effect of the pandemic is that we saw clearly how many people in the United States live marginally. And among those who live marginally, people of color are overrepresented. And that constitutes a problem. And it's not clear to me that the productivity increases are going to get to those people without legislation from the United States Congress and the president that tries to deal with this set of issues. So for me, the clearest thing, the tragedy was the number of people in the United States that are on the margin.
Well, what I'd like to do now is actually turn it over to the audience for questions. And if I could, I'd like to invite Professor Bruce McKern to join us just for a minute to kick this off with our first audience question. Bruce, if you'd be so kind. And by the way, I would note that not only, as I mentioned, Bruce is one of our most prized adjunct professors, but he's also himself a former dean of a business school. He is a colleague of both Dave and Mike, teaching at Stanford, and in fact was a co-author of a very good friend of mine, George Yip, at London Business School. So Bruce is truly our international star, and so we thought it fitting. And he also, quite frankly, was one of the people to start off and create this joint program with SAF and UTS. So Bruce, would you kick it off for us?
Thank you, Chris. I feel I haven't got time to say anything very much at this point after that kind of introduction. But I would like to follow up, Mike and Dave, on your comments about perhaps a resurgence of productivity. There was a lot of talk at the height of the pandemic, and particularly in relation to the tensions with China, about needing to build domestic capacity. We talked about it here in Australia. We reliance on, for particularly medicines, for example, was thought to be a dangerous position to be in. Do you see, based on what you were saying earlier, Mike, about the possibility of these new technologies spreading more widely in a generic way, do you see any impact of that on the ability of the United States and Australia to be more independent of international supply chains in critical areas? I know there may well be some serious cost implications to this, but I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I think we are going to see a movement to increase our self-reliance. You can see it. I mean, you know this very well, Bruce, but I mean, you see it clearly in China because their stated plans in the 14th five-year plan and other documents are to increase I mean, they have different names for it, dual circulation economy and that sort of thing. But basically, they don't like being reliant on the rest of us. And I'm seeing similar things, on a more muted basis in the United States. What the impact of this will be, I mean, we got a lot of productivity growth out of global trade and specialization in the past 30 or 40 years. So I would say that development, which will be driven largely by political and national security considerations, may be a drag on productivity. I mean, it may have beneficial effects from a distributional point of view domestically in a number of economies, but I think that would be more in the category of a headwind, but one that we're willing to pay. The other thing is people debate about the green revolution, and sort of think, well, maybe that'll be a drag on productivity too. And here what I like to say is, you got to remember the time horizon and the measurements. I mean, you know, it's true that heavy investments, both public and private, in the reducing the carbon intensity of our economies may not show up in productivity in the short to medium run, might even have a mildly negative effect. I mean, that's debated, and I don't have, you know, any particular insight in this. But you know, we need to remember that the reason we're making these investments is to avoid a catastrophic, you know, decline in productivity sometime, you know, in a more distant future. When I say catastrophic decline in productivity, it would be a lot worse than that in some scenarios. But so we're investing in productivity. It's just that we have, you know, different time horizons for different kinds of investments. So bottom line is, I think the direction you were going in the question is essentially right. We're going to see more emphasis on self-reliance. We're going to see more emphasis on resilience. We're going to see investments by societies whose principal target is not increasing next year's per capita income, whether it's health, you know, sustainability or other things, and that's not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Could I throw the question to Dave?
Yeah, sure.
Dave, is this self-reliance, if it happens, going to help that group of the population that you were just speaking about who've been so marginalized in the last years?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to tell. First of all, I'm no expert on productivity, except my own. That's all I really encourage. So for me, the question, the way Mike put it is, what is the role that the state has to play in that? And it does seem to me, as the Koreans, when they broke away from being sort of producers of Japanese, sort of an assembly line for Japan, they put a tremendous amount of money into engineering sciences. And the Chinese notion that the United States is on the way down is in large part because I think they think they're going to be better at engineering, et cetera. So the role that the state plays is going to play some significant part in how far we get along Mike's route. And if they're successful in that, then they can make policies to take care of these other things, which my guess would have to be educational, various forms of education to get people from where they are to where they need to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Chris, do you wish to turn to the other questions from the audience?
Okay, the first question actually we have right now is, this was submitted in advance. Will COVID actually be good for the United States in the context of maintaining or improving their global superpower status? Or due to their focus on domestic issues, the tumultuous campaign, the result, the Black Lives Matter movement, and other social unrest, amongst others, could the US's position as the global superpower be forever weakened? How about that for a question for our two panelists?
Well, I guess the way to start it is that if you follow the press in the United States, democracy is on the verge of breaking down. It's like the American political system is broken, blah blah blah. And I've always wondered about that because in regard to the economy, while all this is happening politically, our economy appears to be doing exceedingly well. How is that possible? Because, you know, when I talk to people, I've been in the business school, I have friends who have done quite well in the world. When I talk with them, they just want to know what's going to happen. They want to know, will HR 3 pass or won't it? And if it passes, then they're going to behave this way as opposed to behaving a different way. But the point is, the American economy seems to be doing reasonably well. I can't talk about the long run, but this is true in 2008 and 9 when the press in the United States was talking, the American government is broken, doesn't work. Well, it's true, but the Americans came out of that great recession, came out of it better than anybody else in Europe, came out of it quicker. I'm not talking about the Chinese now. So I'm always interested in the question of the amazing capacity of the American economy to work in spite of how broken our politics, quote, appear to be. I don't
Mike,
on that.
Yeah, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah. I think, you know, we're in a transition period where the rise of, you know, China, prospectively India, notwithstanding the current, you know, horrific situation there, and the possibility that Europe, you know, will pull together in the future. So this is sometimes described as a unipolar world going to a bi or multipolar world, and that those forces seem inevitable. So I'm not worried about the decline of American hegemony or whatever version of it is, and tend to focus on, you know, whether we're doing our part to make that transition, you know, satisfactory from a domestic point of view. You know, so I'm not so worried about the United States, you know, losing its kind of dominant position in the global economy. What I was worried about, and what seems to be better, is that this is not a good time for any major player to turn inward or adopt policies that are sort of deliberately anti-multilateral, you know, in areas where it's really crucial. And so I think the about face on that front, even if it takes time to implement, takes time for our allies to trust us again and so on, that's a good development. But I think that's the world we're going to live in, you know, with, I mean, we're still going to be a big player for a while, but, you know, we've got to do it with holding hands with other people.
I agree with that.
So
we have
we've
a
got
question.
Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
I was going to say, Chris, there's a question from the audience from David Yoon about the quality of the Biden cabinet. May I just say what he says? He says, how much of an improvement has there been in the quality of US cabinet members with Biden compared to Trump? I'm not sure if we'd like to pick that up.
Well, I'm friends with Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster, who are colleagues of mine. But it just strikes me that in terms of, forget the political views for a moment, just in terms of people's accomplishments, their ability to work together, that seems to be a major improvement. My guess is that the turnover ratio will be nowhere near as high as it was under President Trump. And that's important for achieving these. The level of appointments, the number of appointments made at the sub levels is already way ahead of where President Trump was at this time. So I'm pretty encouraged. I'm pretty encouraged about it. Got a little bit of trouble that it wasn't diverse enough, but it's the most diverse cabinet in American history.
That's a good result. And David Yoon, by the way, David says he was a student of yours in the MBA program, so I'm sure he thanks you for that answer.
Tell him I'm glad to see. I'm glad to see you survived that.
That's great. From my point of view, from my point of view, at least the economic people are very, very good. Janet Yellen is a terrific person and a terrific economist, but with being the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, the head of the Federal Reserve overall, and now Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, I think she has a combination of the insight and now experience to be really effective. Cecilia Rouse, I think, is top flight in the Council of Economic Advisors, et cetera. So I think there's some real talent, at least on the economic policy side, that he has recruited to be part of the administration.
Chris, from outside the US, there seems to be a kind of pessimism about the United States, very much, I guess, a result of the social issues we've been seeing happening in the last few years. Dave, you spoke about that segment of the population that is suffering, and it's not clear that there are policies that will create jobs in those areas and in those segments of the population. And yet, on the other hand, we keep hearing about from black leaders themselves that handouts are not the solution. What do you see as likely to be undertaken here to help address this quite deep problem?
Well, there's obviously there's government policies that can help, but for me, and Mike can speak more of this since he helped more than I did, but we have a former student, an African American, who has very ingenious plan to make sure that blacks can get mortgages. There are some companies coming on to help with that. The big gap between black and white wealth, most of that is taken up by the fact that whites have houses and blacks do not have houses, which has to do with the way mortgages are raised and credit ratings, et cetera, et cetera. So I suspect that there's a lot of work being done now. I know there's a lot of work being done by not-for-profits like the one Mike is advising. And then the government's going to have to do what they can, but it's got to be a combination of both.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that the really challenging thing from point of view of our social situation is we have multiple problems. We have a legacy of disadvantage in the African American community, but also just plain racism. We have issues about gender, and yet we also have a bunch of people in the kind of white middle class who feel like they got sideswiped by the economy in the last 30 years. So there's a lot of people, with legitimate grievances about the sort of trajectory we've been on, and the challenge is to deal effectively, in a way that makes it seem like the reality is we're serious about this and we want to sort of kind of fix this over time, but not have it turn into a clash between one group, self-identified group, or another. So we can't ignore the racism in our past and the results that it's created, and we can't, and I don't think we can ignore the impact of globalization and technology on the middle class either. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a politician. I don't know how I would do this, but I think you somehow you've got to sort of create a very big tent under which you sort of try to deal with these things, so you don't turn it into, a zero-sum game in terms of identity politics.
But if you think about this over just our lifetimes, the whole notion of what constitutes a family is that question. The whole notion of what constitutes sex. There was nothing like LGBT. But I can assure you one thing, that in terms of these issues and how they change, if we have bad economies, it's going to be worse, not better. You have to have good economies that are functioning in order to solve these problems. But if you take a look at Silicon Valley, there's no one cares about what your quote gender is or what kind of a family you come from. Question is, can you do what's necessary to do? And it seems to me that other parts of the country are not there, but things will change. But if you don't have a good economy, I think that makes it makes it almost impossible.
Well, we're running a little bit late. I don't want to keep our guests too much longer. We do have just a couple of quick questions. One or two of these I think you can answer very quickly with just kind of your reaction. We had one actually earlier from, let's see, I'll get his name up here, from Doug Rosenberg. And this is actually a very technical, or a straightforward technical one. Do you think eliminating the filibuster is feasible and a good idea for the future? How about you, Dave? What do you think?
No. I mean, no, I don't, because the fact is that if you ask that, how would you have liked to have Donald Trump as president for all those years? I think the filibuster has served a very useful purpose. In regard to change, you might tinker with it. One rule I would prefer is that they go back to the rule that if you're going to filibuster, you have to be there and on the floor and talking. I think they could make it a little bit harder, but I thought the filibuster, it's great when you're in charge to get rid of the filibuster. But I remember when Harry Reid changed the rules on cabinet appointments, and Mitch McConnell said, "You'll come to rule that day." And now there are 3 Supreme Court justices that the Democrats did not like that are there because they changed the rule. So changing rules matters.
And Mike, last question for you. This actually comes from one of our own professors, Bronwyn Dalton, so professor of management. And she asks, how will nonprofits fare under Biden?
I think fairly well. I mean, I think the Biden administration, for the most part, understands that the nonprofits, the civil society organizations, have a really important role to play. So, I mean, some of them will struggle, because everybody's struggling. Some of them are connected to local and state finance, which is also one of the casualties of the pandemic economy. But on the whole, I think there's an appreciation of the importance of these. Now, this is a highly politicized world, right? So you have nonprofits that have what I would call, clear-cut goals with respect to solving some problem, helping some subset of the population. But then, I hesitate to use the word, but it's contaminated by nonprofits, on the left and right that have clear political agendas. And so that, when you stand back and look at it, the picture's cloudy, and I think the Biden administration would do well to try to encourage the ones that, are moving the ball down the field with respect to some sort of social challenge that we face, and not, sort of dance to the tune that's being played on the left in their case, or, on the right in the case of a more conservative administration.
Dave, any final last thoughts?
No, it's coming close to the bewitching hour here.
Okay.
So.
Well, listen, Professors Mike Spence and David Brady, thank you so much on behalf of the many UTS and Stanford Australia Foundation people who are attending today, and our own professional and academic staff. A very sincere thank you to both of you for this very stimulating discussion and all of your insights. I'd also like to thank Professor Bruce McKern for his fielding of questions ever so expertly. But all of you, I can't really clap on this kind of a forum, but clap anyway in the silence of your own rooms. And please thank Mike and David for a wonderful discussion today. Thank you to you both.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, David.
Good to see you guys.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
again.
Pleasure to be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to share the future UTS Business School Stanford Australia Foundation events. In May, we are looking forward to hosting a leading developmental biologist and biotechnology entrepreneur, Professor Lucy Shapiro. We'll be sending out details for this very exciting webinar very soon. On behalf of the UTS Business School and our Stanford Australia Foundation friends, I thank you again for attending today's webinar, and please everyone be safe, stay safe, and for now, goodbye and thank you.